good afternoon. All right, we're going to fight the itis together. We're going to do this together by talking about this, right? About what we're going to do about this. So, mass incarceration, you may know, is a small issue in the United States of America. Who has had some contact with the criminal justice system? Anybody here? And this doesn't mean you've been incarcerated. This doesn't mean you know somebody who maybe has been, you've been a survivor of violence. Let me see full hands. It's a lot of us, right? So people always ask me, like, why are you addressing this system? I'm like, well, why aren't you, right? This is a system that impacts every single one of us. And you may know the United States incarcerates more of its citizens than any country in the entire world. Like, we always love to talk about how we're number one. We are really number one in this. And we incarcerate upwards of 7 million of our citizens, right? So we're spending $70 to $80 billion a year to incarcerate our citizens, criminalize our citizens, rather than healing and educating our citizens. And you may know that while this gap is closing, a grossly disproportionate amount of those are Black and brown men. And what you may not know is the tremendous impact it's having on their families. So 75% of their families can't even meet their basic needs due to having a loved one incarcerated. They spend a whole year's salary on legal and court fees. And so what we're seeing is these multi-generational cycles of incarceration and over a century of disinvestment in our communities of color have left them totally decimated. Totally decimated. It's a disaster. And so you all may be like, oh, Deanna, you're a little slow on the uptake, but it took me a little while to realize this one critical factor. And that is, if we believe in punishment, right? If we believe that there are members of our society who have less value than others, if we let our unconscious biases go unchecked, you all, we build that. You know, we build racism and bigotry and fear into the very fabric of our cities, of our neighborhoods, of our architecture. And the thing is, it amplifies those beliefs, and it exacerbates them, and it foments them, right? There's nothing like a piece of architecture to anchor some beliefs. So we have to be careful about what we believe, and you better be damn sure we better be careful about what we build. It lasts forever. So when we look at how this represents itself in our criminal justice architecture, to me it's just very clear, right? We're able to see in the massing and its location and the materiality, the patriarchy, the hierarchy, security, punishment, and power is all represented in the justice architecture that we build, which is very expensive, by the way. Your tax dollars are invested in building these things. And so a lot of architects, a lot of designers is like, well, let's build better versions of these. We'll build a prettier prison and a prettier jail. And while I'm not saying that those who are incarcerated should be held in bad conditions, I am very clear that that is not how we're going to solve this problem. And some of you may have had this situation, the thing that you're doing isn't the right thing, but you don't know the other thing that you need to be done. Have you been in that situation before? It's a little frustrating. And then, I don't know why somebody didn't tell me about this earlier, but my question, instead of what do we build instead, was answered. And it was answered by another system that I didn't know about. And it was a system called restorative justice. Has anyone heard of restorative justice? Oh, this is great. So many people. I'm going to tell you what it is anyway, because some of you didn't raise your hand, and I want to make sure we're on the same page. It's like a system that's been there all along. This was a system we had before the European model. And it's a philosophy. And what it says is that when a harm has been done, when a crime has happened, it is a breach of relationship. And that the needs of those who have survivors, those who have been harmed, must be addressed, right? So it's not a crime against the state. And that those who have committed that offense have an obligation to make amends and repair the harm that they've done with the potential of repairing the relationship. And so these are intense dialogues with both parties that come together to create a plan to address the offender's conduct. This happens in Capital One murder cases. This happens in mass social conflict. This happens in just graffiti. What we find is that victims have reduced levels of PTSD. We have a reduction in violent offending of up to 70%. Victims, when offered punitive or restorative, 90% are choosing restorative justice, and district attorneys are diverting cases out of court all over the country into restorative justice so people have no contact with the justice system at all. And so my question then became, well, damn, why aren't we designing for this system? If justice can be connected to love, to healing, to reparation, then what does that look like? Right? So that was the doorway for me. And I didn't know how to do that either, to be honest. And I did the thing that designers do where we go into a room and we come up with sexy forms and we come out and it's like, this is it, right? This is the thing. And so I had a friend of mine, Dr. Barb Taves, who's a social worker and restorative justice practitioner who was also interested in design. And she invited me to actually ask people who might know what to do. And so what we began to do was run the country's first design studios in high security settings with everyone from people in jail for 1 to 2 years to lifers around the intersection of restorative justice and design. We created a toolkit to do that because you can't bring X-Acto blades into prison, you can't bring in the glue guns, right? But it was just a series of folding and ripping of paper. And this is an online tool that you can use at www.designingjustice.com, and people are now using it all over the world to start to re-envision justice. And what we found is that the power of design as a creative practice, we're helping many of our students heal from trauma, right? So they were processing trauma. I would have grown men in my classes in prison crying for the first time as they started to imagine the kind of environment that they would need to face the person they had harmed. And understanding that 95% of these folks have been on both sides of the harm. I was working in a jail in San Francisco. 100% of those women are survivors of sexual violence, right? So they know what restorative justice really means, and their visions were huge. And we were able to talk to hundreds of them, and now thousands of them, and in communities, to start to figure out, what do we need to build instead of prisons and jails? So I want to talk to you about what I think it is. And this is one of the first times I'm also talking about this to folks, and I'm going to show you 3 examples, because I like to just get to the projects. Like, let's look at the stuff, because we can imagine it, right? We can do a lot of creative thinking, but we really got to build this stuff, you all. We have to amplify a different kind of future for ourselves. So we're going to talk about restorative reinvestments, restorative reentry, and the reimagining and repurposing of the dying criminal infrastructure that we used to imagine. Now we've got to make it do something different. And I'm going to start with restorative reinvestments because it's my favorite, and it's where we started. And we really started by looking like, what do we build to divert people out of the system altogether, right? What does that infrastructure look like? How do we, again, build for restorative justice? And so one of the first projects that we did was in Syracuse, New York, in the near West Side, which is a very low-income community in Syracuse, but richly, richly diverse. And it was the first time that I started to learn that the way that we can start to work as designers is to be right up front with the program providers. So what we did was work with the Center for Court Innovation. They're a think tank out of New York, and what they were doing was bringing Native American peacemaking practices into a non-Native community for the very first time in the United States, right? We've been exporting our European model to our Native and First Nations communities forever. This was the first time with the Navajo that it was going back the other way. And so what would happen is that the judges and the DAs would divert cases out of court and into peacemaking in the community. These are quality of life crimes, right? So you stole my car, you stole my purse. You're coming into this process, and it's elders in the community who are actually moderating the conflict. And there's no record after this, right? So as they were developing that program, I was trying to figure out, well, shoot, what does a peacemaking center even look like? I mean, how many of you have been in a courthouse? That's like almost everybody. Who's been in a prison or a jail? Quite a few. Right? Who's been in a peacemaking center before? There's always one person. I'm like, where is that peacemaking center? Well, I didn't know. I had never been to one, right? I don't know what that space looks like, so I got trained as a circle keeper, right? I learned how to do peacemaking myself, and I was able to do something called the peacemaking palette, where I was running circles in the community around an object, a color, a texture that you needed to feel at peace, to face conflict. We did role playing, and I was able to code and analyze that data to come up with a whole set of design guidelines and ideas on what to do. We also worked with the community for almost a year just to find a location for peacemaking, because it really needed to be on neutral territory. And what we found was an old drug house that we were able to turn into a peacemaking center. It was just an old home. And what was interesting that happened, which was unexpected, is the Center for Court Innovation is like, okay, we maybe will do 10 cases a year, right? Nobody's done peacemaking before. We're not going to really hit any targets. But what happened is that it was the space that actually convinced people to engage in the process, right? People were coming into this environment and looking around because they had a choice, right? There was a choice. And they were making a different choice. And they ended up doing over 80 cases that year, and then over 100 cases that year, almost every time having to do with the amplification of the program through place, right? So the power of that together is critical. It was critical. And so we were starting to do these sort of singular buildings, but what we were also experiencing was this huge systemic issues that we had to start to address. Like, how do we really scale this up? And we needed to start to think bigger. And we also needed to expand our services, right? So it was, for the first time, it was like, okay, it's not enough to be an architect or a designer. You also have to be a peacemaker. But what we also started to look at was something we call restorative economics, and began to include in-house financial planning and thinking, right? So what we're starting to see, which you'll see me build over this time, is actually the constellation of people we need and disciplines we need to start to address systemic change. And so we started to look at how do we start to divert that funding out of criminal justice, that $80 billion, back into more restorative infrastructure. And so the idea we came up with and started to do, and we're still working on, is the Restorative Justice City Reinvestment Tool. What would it look like if the entire city used restorative justice as the primary way of addressing harm in the community? What kind of infrastructure would we need? And what we did was started to look at folks like the Justice Mapping Center, Spatial Information Lab, how people were using the collection of data to help people see where resources were going and where they needed to be. And the development of a digital tool or a mapping tool where we would collect grassroots data from the community. They would be contributing, layered over macro level data, so that could be redistributed. And we started that process in Oakland, where I'm from. We're doing it now also in Detroit. And what we did was we gathered the police, restorative justice experts, the county, the city, to start to think through what kind of infrastructure would we really need to do this. And we came up with a lot of ideas, these incredible maps with the Institute for the Future, who are futurists, which I'd never even heard of futurists before, but they exist, and they help us plan for a future. And we came up with this map, which was a whole constellation of justice hubs that would be located in the flatlands of Oakland, where there's huge socioeconomic disparities. I don't know if you know Oakland well, but the flats are where all the rich diversity is, and up in the hills, people have they live 15 years longer, right? So there's huge life expectancy issues. And so this is a big, bold move, right? You step out and you think about a whole city, but what was still amazing to me, out of it came a new prototype, right? A space and environment we hadn't thought about, and that was Restore Oakland. Restore Oakland is one of those glowing orbs that you saw. And Restore Oakland is the country's first center for restorative justice and restorative economics. And what we did was we were able to help 2 nonprofits purchase a building. We helped them locate it, we helped negotiate the purchase and sale agreement on it, and we gutted it, and we're turning it into 3 things. Well, we've turned it. It has opened. Last time I always spoke about it, it hadn't opened. It just opened like 2 months ago. And what it is on the ground floor, there's a restaurant that trains low-wage restaurant workers to get living wage jobs. The restaurant opens next week, so I don't have the picture yet, so you get a rendering today. But it looks just like this, And what it does is they will train 500 people a year in fine dining, as chefs, as servers, many formerly incarcerated folks, low-income women of color, immigrants, to get jobs that are living wage jobs in the Bay Area that rival tech jobs, right? So we break the racial divide of the black and brown folks at the front, the white folks up front, the men up front, doing all of that. And it's been already successful as they start to train folks. On the 2nd floor, we have the headquarters for the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights, Causa Justa Just Cause, doing immigrant rights and tenant rights. So you're starting to see the co-location of economic justice, social justice, racial justice, food justice. And what's also happening here is the county's first and some of the country's first dedicated spaces for restorative justice. So young people, 15 to 21, are getting diverted out of court and into this space, so they're able to double their caseload, and these young people will have a chance to stay out of the system altogether. Thank you. So what started to happen was actually a consolidation of a process, right? As designers, we design things, but we can also design processes, which are almost always more important in the end. Right, so we developed something called the concept development process. It's design, it's finance, it's policy, and program. All of these things are getting designed together through a creative act, right? what I know, and I can tell you all that when I go into a situation, and criminal justice is some of the most rigorous people, right? I got yelled at by a warden the other day, like, what are you doing? But when you engage people in creative practice, it helps them break out, right, of this really solid thing. This is something designers have so much power to do. And what this process has helped us do is that at the end of this, we've been able to create a package that's allowed us to leverage almost $200,000 worth of funding into our concept development fund, which helps us do this process, into over $21 million of leveraged investments back into community. Right? So just the act of creativity around these intersections allows us to go to banks, social impact lenders, et cetera, to build things. Buildings are expensive, right? They're not $500, they're $10 million. And a jail is $300 million. So this process has been critical for us in the development of this next type of infrastructure, which is restorative reentry. I don't know if you know any folks who've ever tried to reenter coming from prison, but it's brutal, right? And in California, there are literally over 4,000 barriers to success. And the intersection of criminal justice with homelessness, with the foster care system, lack of access to barriers to education, to workforce, there's like, I don't even know how they do it. So part of what we have had to focus on is we want the 2 million people coming home to be able to survive. We have to build for that. And that includes policy change. So one thing we've tried to do is stack functions. We like to stack functions, right? You do one thing, you do 4 things. And so we've started to talk to Black churches, because Black churches are asset rich, but they're cash poor, right? They have valuable land and valuable buildings that are literally sitting empty. And then we've also started to work with program providers who are providing all the wraparound needs and services that people need coming home. They need therapy, they need workforce development training, they need a place to live. And what we've done is we've started to create a concept called the Hope Reentry Campus, where we're taking the vacant and abandoned buildings of churches like the Hope Center of Life Church and turning it into a reentry facility for 50 incarcerated men and women. And what it will have is all kinds of wraparound services, family reunification spaces, spaces for them to do urban farming outside, a gym, cool-off spaces, classrooms where they can get workforce training. It also has a social enterprise. I love social enterprise. We always are trying to build this into our projects because this is a place where they can generate revenue, right? We want economic sustainability in our projects. It's not enough to make it look good. You have to sort of figure out how it's going to keep running. And this sort of front-facing piece helps with the NIMBYism, the not in my backyard piece, right? Where there's a front-facing piece where the community can engage with both the church and the men who are living there. An interesting thing came out of this process that we hadn't expected, which gets us in a lot of trouble, is that we were like, okay, well, usually you put 10 folks in a room, right? You gotta imagine a lot of reentry facilities have 10 upwards of 15 people in a room with a bed and a dresser. That's it. And they're in there for a year or 2 years, right? So it's highly stressful, it's unsafe. And we started to work with men locally and like, we need a way to have privacy and dignity. And what we developed was something called mobile refuge rooms. The cost of construction is high in the Bay Area, and this is a quarter of the price. And what these are modular rooms that pop open to provide that kind of environment of privacy and dignity for men and women returning. And they were also able to not only design it with us, but we also had a relationship with a local community college where they were able to go into fab labs and learn how to do digital fabrication, thereby creating a living wage skill, right? So we wanted to stack all the functions in every move that we make, both designing it, fabricating it, and then the Alameda County Department of Probation was like, I'll take 15, because I have thousands of these men coming home. And so what's exciting about the unit is that when you're in it, it feels like a real room, like I would live in this. But often in certain situations, you need flexibility. This can also be used with unhoused folks, right? So people are homeless inside of situations, but it packs up and moves away and can be rolled away very, very easily. And so this will now be a spin-off of DJDS. We are hoping that it'll be a whole other social enterprise that trains formerly incarcerated men and women in digital fabrication and provides housing for them and others. Thanks. So the third piece of infrastructure that we need to look at. So the good news is we're kind of tipping over the mass incarceration piece. I think we're have 0.1% less, right? It's not good enough, but we're getting there. But what's happening is we're now seeing all this empty infrastructure. We have hundreds of empty prisons and jails all over the country. They're closing down. And I don't know if have you all been to those justice corps, where the bail bondsman is? You guys ever find yourself down there? It's like the armpit of every city, right? There's like the courthouse, and nobody goes there unless you have to pay a ticket. And so these things are dying. And when they're left empty, the economic piece that they did create, especially in rural communities, is lost, right? People don't have jobs. You need to sort of start to rethink that. Often they get repurposed as immigration detention facilities. So there's some speed required to repurposing these facilities, both in our urban and rural context. And what's happened is in the last year, I've gotten 4 of these projects. I mean, they are flying in the door. This is one that we're looking to do in Beaumont, Texas, called the Welding Justice Project Dream Center. And what we've realized is that those empty jails and prisons map over the lack of jobs in welding and construction in the country. And we know we have hundreds of welding jobs that need to be fulfilled, and that this infrastructure is actually perfect for welding schools. And so we've started to work with the American Welding Society, Miller, to start to prototype the idea of taking these facilities and turning them into that, thereby fulfilling the jobs that we need in our economic situation and doing workforce training for those formerly incarcerated, and they can live here, and it's tied into a program. And so that's the kind of strategy. We're going from 1, and we hope to do 50. That's how many that we actually need to build, so y'all need to help me. Another project that we are currently working on with my whole staff is in Atlanta. So Atlanta has, like many places, a massive jail downtown. It is ugly. I mean, you can see this thing. It's a beast. 450,000 square feet, used to house thousands of people, a lot of pain in this place. And they were with sort of local community activists, which we love to work with, Racial Justice Action Center, Women on the Rise, who fought the mayor's office and be like, you need to close this down. There are like 100 people left. It's costing us $33 million a year to keep this thing running. That's our tax dollars. We want it down. And so I believe that the process that we're doing in Atlanta is an exemplary process for other cities around the country. And literally, we're figuring it out now, right? It's ourselves. It's the mayor's office, it's community activists, it's policy people, Bloomberg's involved. We have a task force representing the whole city, and we're spending the entire rest of the year and early next year engaging what feels like the entire city of Atlanta. And what we're doing is developing tools and games and models to be like, what do you need to have happen here to turn this into a center for equity? Right? And what can we do together to create another sort of idea, concept, vibrancy to downtown Atlanta? So watch this one as we try to figure out how we can work together to make this actually typical practice in city after city. So I'm going to show you one more project that kind of encompasses all the things. It's weird. It's like the weirdest project in our office. It is a beast. I was talking to my host this morning about, you have this idea, like you're sitting there like, oh, I have an idea. And then you're sorry you had that idea because it takes over your whole life, as this has done. So the pop-up village was in response to this, right? This sort of disinvestment I was talking about in the beginning. There's no public transportation to get anywhere. People can't afford a car. Like a half mile away is too far for a lot of folks who are very low income. We just haven't invested. There's no retail. There's no medical facilities. There's nothing. And so what was happening is that we're like, well, we can't build all these buildings, right? That's just not possible. But could we develop a mobile infrastructure that would bring a constellation of resources to the community? And that is what we have done, right? The idea is that it's a site activation tool. So it activates blighted sites and underserved communities, bringing a whole range of resources. And it's beautiful, right? It's got to be beautiful, right? All the environments have to be beautiful. And we spent over a year engaging various communities on what should it look like, what should be there, where should it go, and this is what they told us. That when the village comes, it needs to have all these neighborhoods as we come. So it's not a farmer's market, right? It's an active place where all of these things are happening as if a whole village came. And the village can come from 5 hours up to 2 days. Right? It just sort of depends on what the need and the situation is. We're now working on a pregnancy village. I don't even know what that looks like, but we're going to figure that out. And so our role in leading this project all of a sudden turned in like we had to do operations. We had to do the programming. I hired a community liaison. I now have a community organizer on staff. I have an operations team. And we make stuff too, right? So we built these shops that pop up to bring a sort of highly customized space to micro-entrepreneurs who can come out and sell the things that they make in their homes. We made a whole series of like pop-up components we called, or mobile site components that include everything from beanbag chairs to turf to shades, so that the whole environment, the interconnectivity between things, buildings and spaces, is filled with a nourishing sort of tactile and emotional experience for them. And people come and they stay, and they just stay, you know? They don't go, they hang out, super chill. Like the vibe is super chill. There's always music. I'll show the video. I won't talk more, you'll see the video. And so what we've also done is taken some buses and trailers. The city donated this bus to us. And one of the issues was that we needed an educational component, and one of our program providers, like, people just aren't coming to our bricks and mortar sites, right? They can't get there. Turns out turf lines, it's scared across the street. I might get shot. I can't get there. I've got no car. So we turned this bus into a classroom. And this classroom travels across those turf lines. It anchors the village with education, and it has space for 15 students in it and a teacher. And what's been happening is that people are pulling themselves out of the bricks and mortar sites to go to school on this bus. If the bus doesn't come, they don't even go to school. I just thought the buses will be stigmatizing. But turns out if you build them with people, it has impact, right? It's beautiful, and people love to go there. And they're able to serve 3,000 more students a year than they were without it. We've also been working with formerly incarcerated and currently incarcerated women around an issue that they get released from jail in the middle of the night, and it's very unsafe. Right? We lost a woman the other day to that situation. We also have huge problems with sex trafficking, at least in Oakland, and in many cities we have that issue. And just women getting access to basic services. So what we created was a trailer we call the Women's Mobile Refuge Trailer. That trailer also anchors the village, providing resources for women. And the women are able to come there, they're able to get a meal, they're able to get a change of clothes, they're able to meet with a caseworker, right? I was like, oh, you guys want beds. Like, they didn't want beds, right? They wanted loungers, right? So you see the loungers. Like, I had to have those for them. But they knew exactly what they wanted. I didn't need to make it up. And it's already on the road, it's doing great, and it's a piece of the village that has its own life. So I will show it to you real quickly. Ignore the part with me dancing. I hate that. That's so embarrassing. So if you're ever in the Bay, come by our village. It's cool. It's cool. So I just want to leave you with maybe an ask, right? Just a question. I ask you to go home and think about when you're harmed, if you've done harm, if someone should harm you really seriously, would you be able to engage in restorative practices with them? Would you be able to step into a space with them to have a conversation? Or would you want punishment? Would you want retribution? There's no judgment there, right? When people have been harmed, they need choice. They need a choice. But I asked you to think about it as you go home. And I asked to think about a justice rooted in love, what that looks like. And do we want that for ourselves and for our future? I do. I don't think it'll be easy, but I hope you'll join me in doing that as designers, as practitioners, as whatever you go home in your lives to do. I would appreciate it, and I look forward to doing it with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I scoop you for a...
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. I'll take the far one.
Okay.
Okay. Actually, first thing I want to ask you is, I'm noticing folks who are really good at going out, seeing something as big as this, going out and really finding some ways to I don't know if you want to say fix it, but find a better way to do it. How are you taking care of yourself?
Everyone keeps asking me that. Is it that bad, y'all? Do I look that haggard?
I cannot imagine.
Somebody asked that yesterday. I'm like, I do okay.
I can't imagine taking on something as massive as the criminal justice system, in a sense, and not feeling the impact of giving myself, like if I'm imagining myself doing your work, I'm throwing myself at it completely. I don't know if I would be taking the time for myself. So you look fine. I'm wondering,
Okay,
I'm wondering if you are able to do for yourself what you're doing for others, which is really taking the time.
Well, first, I'm not doing this alone. I do this with an amazing team. My team is amazing. There are 8 of us. They're awesome. Like, I'm happy to go and be with them every day. They also put themselves out there. And there's a ton of people right now. I mean, there's a time nobody returned my calls. There are a ton of people out there doing criminal justice reform work. And these activists that I work with every day, I just support them, right? I'm really behind them. And, you know, in terms of caring for self, I mean, beyond social justice, I care a lot about spirituality and personal growth and development. That is, like this weekend, I'll be at the Science and Non-Duality Conference, nerding out on quarks and, you know, quantum physics and God, whatever. Like, I love that
chakras.
Stuff, right? Yeah, like chakras. Like, I'm a total woo-woo person.
Yeah.
And so I woo-woo. That's how I get myself, keep myself together. I meditate. I meditate every day.
Yeah.
You know, I do that stuff. You have to. You have to. I mean, if you don't do that, then, you know, I have a therapist. I have an executive coach. I have a women's group. I do racial healing work. I do real restorative justice work around white supremacy and historical legacy of slavery with black and white people. So it's like healing is critical. We have to heal as a society, and I think the work itself is healing and can be. So those are, with that lens, I try to do it. I don't do it as good as I need to, but I try.
Well, the fact that you're doing it, I mean, oftentimes we know the doctor who says, you know, you need to do this for your asthma and then goes out and smokes a cigarette, right?
I've seen that. I've seen that happen in real life. It's
that's the
so
thing.
true.
Yeah. So, but seeing how this is, I guess, holistic, but this is running through and through, you know, there's no spiritual laziness is a term I've heard before. You don't sound like a spiritually lazy person.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, I don't know if you could be.
No.
Yeah.
I'm trying, but it's not working out.
Okay. Try to sleep in Sundays or whatever.
Try to.
Can you talk a little bit more about why beauty is necessary? I love that, because prisons are oftentimes very ugly. You meet very beautiful people in there. But the prisons themselves are very ugly, stoic spots. So, yeah.
Well, you know, again, it goes like, what is your value and belief? And you build that thing. If you think that people deserve beautiful spaces because they're valuable and that space heals and can repair, you would build that. I think, you know what often happens in our spaces, which is interesting, is that people will go in them and then they'll walk out again because they don't think it's for them.
Oh, wow, yeah.
This can't possibly be for me. Because spaces love us, right? Environments love and care. It's how we love and care for ourselves. I mean, I bet most people in this room use their environment to love and care for themselves. That's what space does. That's what beauty does. And most folks who have been very low income have no capacity to pay for that, to do that. There's none of our institutional architecture does that, right? We don't build, like, you know, we just don't build that because it's supposed to be expensive. But I don't, you know, our projects, we never have any money on our projects, but somehow we manage to make spaces that care for people. We work hard to make them like that, but it has to be a priority and it has to be a value, right? You have to value it and know that people actually need it to heal, and they need it. Like those mobile refuge rooms are gonna be, they need them. It's not a nice to have. Like your stuff's not working because your environment is shit. Like it's people are not finishing programs. People don't want to go there because it's horrible.
Right.
And you're making people worse. If you know, it's just basic logical sense.
Yeah.
Beautiful environments help us to heal and to act and behave differently.
And they know what they want. That was the other piece that I liked.
They know exactly what they need.
And you're listening to them and go, did you notice the minute we started talking about beauty, somebody's phone went off, but it was like tinkly, beautiful fairy music? Did anybody else hear that? Like just the moment that happened, we were like being supported by technological cosmos intersect. I don't know. Oh, you were talking about before upstairs, and here, of course, on stage, but design really steering, leading, informing politics. Can you talk some more about that?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that we have traditionally practiced in the agency of the wealthy and the institutional coming after the fact, like most institutional partners or government entities are like, okay, we have the idea and now we'll call the architects or now we'll call the people. That's got to change. You know, we have to be way out front, you know, because the way that we think, the creative practice, I told you about the creative practice, like people are not going to break out of their siloed way of thinking unless some creative practice comes into it. So I think that one way for us to consider practicing is look at a systemic issue that you want to address and start to really look at it. You know, does this system even make sense? And I think the way that we did it was sort of like, I don't respond to RFPs, we don't do competitions, you know, we come up with ideas through conversations with people and be like, you know what, you need a thing. Let's make it together. And, you know, to sort of say that actually the criminal justice system is a horrible system that doesn't work for anybody, really, except for some people. Why are we, architects are like, well, let's fix that. Like, no.
Who does it work for? When you say it works for some people?
I think it works for wealthy folks.
The investors in the prisons themselves?
I mean, I think, you know, I think it works, yeah. I mean, it works for a handful of folks who are like, yep, this is a good system. Lawyers seem to like it. Judges love it, you know. Like, don't tell a judge that, you know, they should think about restorative justice or like, well, then I won't have a job. I'm like, no, you won't have a job. You won't have a job. I mean, really, they're like, no thanks, so,
well,
yeah.
Wouldn't there be space for, I love the idea that there would be support groups for judges that are out of work.
They need out of work. Imagine when I can go to an out of work judge support group, we have been successful.
It'll be like a limp robe is their logo.
Well, know what? I know. I know.
Yeah.
I have known 2 judges that left their position to do restorative justice.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, they have, and they're like, they're like happier, lighter. Like I'm like, yeah, because this works. Yeah. This is a system that makes sense. So I think as a designer, we were like, oh, here is a system that seems to be effective. What if we design for that? Or I think we heard about Liz, like, oh, there's this issue. Nobody's designing with disabled folks. Like, it's a huge desert of design. Like, get out there. Like, she's way out there, right? In the front. And it's hard out front. You know, you're fighting, but we need to be there. We need to be there.
And again, because I'm able to watch some of what your presentation is, and then I have to, you know, logistically pay attention to other things backstage. I don't mean to be redundant here. But as I understand it, this was something that came up for you when you were quite young. Is that true?
I mean, you know, isn't everything we do come up for us from when you're young?
Well, that's kind of what I'm getting at, yeah.
Like, isn't all the stuff there? I mean...
I guess the buy-in for the audience that way is there's a qualification that we don't think of that we earn when we're quite young with our good idea, and then a lot of times we smush it down.
Yeah, you can. I mean, I think, I wanted to be an architect from a super young age. Like, I just knew it. Like, I mean, I didn't know what that was, but I was doing it. And so there was a natural desire to want to make space. And then my father was clear with me that criminal justice or the justice system was something I shouldn't go anywhere near. That it wasn't fair for women, it wasn't fair to people of color. I mean, just stay out of it. Like, don't get a divorce, don't even go near that thing. Like, forget it. And I believed that, you know, that this was not a system for me. And I remember my uncle was killed by 3 boys. And he was about in his 70s. He was super sweet, my Uncle Charlie, like the sweetest guy. And, you know, as a young person, I'm like, well, what? I didn't want to like, hey, those guys should go to prison. I was like, well, why did they do that?
Why?
Why did you do that to my uncle? I know he didn't do anything to you. And that is the first desire of people who often survive that stuff. So I think the constellation of things, as I got older, it was like, you know, I want my work to have some meaning. Yeah. I'm tired of work. I worked for rich developers forever. Yeah. You know, elite institutions, rich homes for rich people. Like, I did that, which was cool, right? I did it. But then I'm like, this is not what I want to do with my life, you know? This is not, this is having no meaning. As a matter of fact, I think I'm doing damage. That was I think I'm hurting some people. and that's not what I want to do.
Well, that's the importance of getting granular, because you might be in the field and doing the work, but it still doesn't quite sit right. And so now you've got the income coming in, you've got the accolades coming in, you've got whatever, but there's still something that's off about it, and it takes work. So my why, to just tangent jump for a second, why do we release women late at night?
Yeah.
Why do we do that?
It's so stupid, right? It's the dumbest thing. It actually comes out of a policy to protect them, right? You can't hold people in custody for longer than their case is done, right? So as soon as the paperwork is processed, you have to release them, or else you're detaining them illegally, right? So that's the reason. I'm like, so change the policy, right?
Yeah.
The thing is that half the time our jails are full or things like that happen because of bad policy.
Mm-hmm.
We should also designers need to be helping people make policy too, right? It's just, that's what it does. So I'm like, can you change the policy? Well, so now we're trying to like create mobile refuge rooms and like, but they will change the policy. It will get changed because the women had to fight for it.
Yeah, yeah. What kind of music do you listen to?
I listen to everything but Chinese opera. I don't like that.
Whoa! That's so specific.
Very specific. And I used to not like country western, but then I went line dancing in Nashville. That was fun.
Yeah.
That was fun. I was like, oh, okay, I get this.
Yeah,
I get
it
this.
clicks.
It totally clicked. I was like, yeehaw.
Yeah, huh?
There you go.
But that bougie Chinese opera.
Hey, have you listened to Chinese opera? Have you listened to it? Have y'all heard that stuff? It's horrible. I'm sorry if someone here loves Chinese opera.
I love that.
Sorry, we're digressing way off.
I don't know. This is fantastic. This is like a big dry patch. Like you're like this fully rounded person. You know how to talk to God and the criminal system and all this stuff.
Right.
But I think that's a pocket of ignorance, and I think that you need to. I think you need to find it in your schedule to really work on this.
I'm gonna work on it.
Okay. Shoot, there were some other things. Oh, I was just wondering, what do we got? We got like a minute. Oh, well, actually, we've got a minute. Let me ask you, is there anything that you would like to say or anything that you would like to bring up that has occurred to you with this a little bit of time? Otherwise, I have a question for you.
I'll take a question.
Okay, all right, cool. So I was just wondering about I was actually wondering about the logistical concerns around having a restaurant. And so why are you choosing food? Because opening a restaurant is tricky, and we want that to sustain.
I don't run the restaurant. It's not
Sure.
my restaurant. Don't get it twisted. I don't
Sure.
have anything to do with restaurants, but what I do is
And this
like,
is ROC United, right?
Yeah, Rock United runs that restaurant. They're
Okay.
doing the training, but what we've learned is about spaces for justice have to have food.
Okay.
Like, they have to have food, and good food.
Yeah.
And healthy food, and equitable, like food that is being created by and for folks, that we're trying to serve. So the food component's actually the most critical piece, and we learned that from the very beginning in peacemaking. A peacemaking process involves breaking bread, right? Hospitality, nourishing ourselves, every culture does food, so justice is equal to food, and there's food in every single project that we do.
I remember a friend getting out of prison, and that's what he scared us all with, was talking about, I mean, it sounds like a joke, but it was talking about how bad the food was.
Oh, I've seen it. It's bad.
Yeah.
I've eaten it. It's bad.
Yeah.
It's bad.
We're just slightly over time. Can we please give a warm and resounding applause